Judea, a strip of hill country and desert on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. From the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea is about 160 kilometers. You could walk the whole province in a week. Rome annexed it as a province in AD 6, after deposing a client ruler, Herod's son, whom Rome had never allowed to call himself king. It was run by a prefect, and the prefect did not live in Jerusalem. He lived at Caesarea Maritima, a harbor city on the coast, built by Herod out of Roman concrete. Jerusalem got a garrison and a visit at festival time. Now pull back and look at the scale. Rome held roughly 30 provinces and perhaps 50 to 60 million people. Judea held maybe 1 million. It sent no famous legions, produced no emperor, exported nothing Rome could not get elsewhere. Its one peculiarity was religious. Its people would not sacrifice to the emperor, and Rome had granted an exemption rather than fight about it. Judea was a minor province in an empire of 30. Nothing on the map in the year 30 suggests this is the one that matters. The movement that starts here starts entirely inside Judaism. Its ground is Galilee, Nazareth, Capernaum, a freshwater lake ringed with fishing towns. The Gospels describe a teacher moving between synagogues and going up to Jerusalem for the pilgrim festivals. His earliest followers kept the Sabbath. They kept the food laws. They prayed in the temple courts with everybody else. Somewhere between AD 30 and 33, under the prefect Pontius Pilate, that teacher was executed in Jerusalem by crucifixion. Crucifixion was the standard Roman penalty for sedition, banditry, and slave revolt. Rome used it in the thousands. Josephus describes mass crucifixions outside these same walls within the same century. Administratively, this was routine. What follows stays small and stays local. A community forms in Jerusalem. It meets in houses. It still goes up to the temple. On the map, that is one dot, and it does not move. Then comes the decision that changes the geography. Around AD 48 to 50, the leaders of that community met in Jerusalem to settle a furious practical argument. Could non-Jews join without circumcision and the full law? They ruled that they could. That ruling, not the crucifixion, is what makes the rest of this film possible. A movement tied to one people has a ceiling. A movement open to anyone has a map. The Via Egnatia, 1,100 kilometers of stone, running from the Adriatic coast across Macedonia to Byzantium. Rome began it around 146 BC and spent a generation building it. The eastern leg to Byzantium came later still. It was built to move armies and couriers. Nobody built it for missionaries. By the 1st century, the empire had something no earlier world possessed: a single connected surface. Roughly 80,000 kilometers of paved main road, with milestones, way stations, and inns. A Mediterranean cleared of large-scale piracy since Pompey's campaign of 67 BC. Greek understood in markets from Marseille to Antioch. One legal system, one coinage, one set of travel documents. A letter could cross from Rome to Ephesus in about 3 weeks in good weather. Rome built the roads to move legions. It had no way of knowing what else would travel on them. Onto that surface steps Paul of Tarsus. Over roughly 20 years, he covers an estimated 16,000 kilometers, on foot and by ship. Watch where he goes. Antioch, Cyprus, Ephesus, Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth, Athens, and finally Rome. Now watch where he does not go. He avoids villages entirely. He goes inland only where a road takes him. Every name on that list is a port, a provincial capital, or a road junction. Ephesus was a harbor of perhaps 50,000 people, the leading port of Roman Asia. Corinth sat on an isthmus and controlled 2 seas. This is not a wave washing outward. It is a network being wired, node by node. The letters run on the same wires. Paul writes back to congregations he has already planted, and the letters travel the roads he traveled. Romans, Corinthians, Philippians, these are not books. They are correspondence with a mailing list. And the hub is not Jerusalem. It is Antioch on the Orontes, 3rd city of the empire, perhaps 250,000 people. It sits where the roads from Asia meet the road to the sea. Antioch pays for the journeys. Antioch sends the people. And Acts records that it was at Antioch that followers of the movement were first called Christians. By about AD 60, there are congregations in perhaps 40 cities. Between those cities, on the map, there is nothing at all. The countryside is barely touched. The Latin for a country villager was paganus. It is one likely root of the word pagan. Christianity was a religion of cities, and it stayed one for 300 years. 6 million. That is one careful estimate of how many Christians were alive in the Roman Empire in the year 300. 260 years earlier there had been, at most, a few thousand. No army moved. No territory was conquered. So how? First, clear away the myth. Persecution was real. It was also rare, brief, and local. In 64, after the Great Fire, Nero executed Christians in Rome. One city, one emperor, 1 year. In 250, Decius ordered every inhabitant of the empire to sacrifice and collect a certificate. Thousands complied. Some refused. The edict lapsed inside 18 months. The Great Persecution under Diocletian, from 303, was the serious one. Churches demolished, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned, hardest in the eastern provinces. It ran 8 years and ended in surrender. Most modern estimates put the total executed by Rome, across all of it, in the low thousands. Historians' estimates vary, and the ancient accounts inflate. Between the flashes, mostly nothing. Around the year 112, Pliny the Younger, governing Bithynia, wrote to the Emperor Trajan to ask what the policy actually was. Trajan's reply survives. Do not hunt them down. Do not accept anonymous accusations. Punish only those brought before you who refuse to recant. That is not a war on a religion. That is an administrative shrug. So the growth is not martyrdom. It is arithmetic. The sociologist Rodney Stark modeled it. Start with 1,000 believers in AD 40. Apply 40% growth per decade. You arrive at about 6 million by 300. That is not a miraculous rate. It is roughly what the Mormon Church managed between 1880 and 1980. Bart Ehrman disputes the starting figure and argues the rate swung by century. The curve, broadly, survives the argument. Compound interest is invisible for 2 centuries, and then it is everywhere. Why did it compound in cities? Because ancient cities were death traps. Density was extreme, sanitation was poor, and epidemics arrived on schedule. The Antonine Plague from 165, the Cyprianic Plague from 249. Contemporary Christian writers describe congregations nursing their sick instead of fleeing. Basic nursing raises survival rates, with no medicine involved at all. Add burial societies for people with no family to bury them. Add no entry fee and no initiation cost. Add women, who joined in disproportionate numbers and married outward. That is Stark's argument. The evidence is thin, and the point is disputed. Persecution was real, but it was rare and it was local. What ended Roman paganism was not martyrdom. It was compound interest. Constantine was a soldier before he was anything else. By October 312, he had an army in Italy and a rival to remove. On the 28th, he beat Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, on the northern edge of Rome. Christian writers afterwards said he had fought under a Christian sign. What is certain is the paperwork that followed. In 313, at Milan, Constantine and Licinius agreed 2 things. Everyone in the empire could worship as they chose, and confiscated church property had to be handed back. Read that carefully and notice what it does not say. It does not make Christianity the religion of Rome. It makes it legal. Constantine kept the old pagan title Pontifex Maximus. He was baptized only on his deathbed, in 337. But legal turned into favored very fast. Bishops received tax exemptions and the right to judge civil cases. Imperial money built basilicas at Rome, at Jerusalem, at Trier. Then something genuinely new. In 325, the emperor summoned bishops from across the empire to Nicaea, in Bithynia, and paid their traveling costs. Ancient sources give attendance figures from about 220 to 318. Historians' estimates vary. They came from Egypt, Syria, Greece, North Africa, one from Spain, at least one from inside Persia. A single institution was now pulling delegates across 4,000 kilometers. They argued about one Greek word. Was the son homoousios, of the same substance, as the father, or only similar? Nicaea ruled, the same. The losing position, associated with the priest Arius, would trouble the empire for 2 more generations. Set the theology aside and look at the mechanism. Doctrine is now settled by imperial summons, at imperial expense, enforced by imperial exile. Nothing like that had ever happened. Constantine then moved the center of gravity. In 330, he dedicated a new capital on the Bosphorus, on the site of Old Byzantium. He called it Constantinople. It was laid out with churches at its center, but also with a temple to the city's Tyche, shrines to the Dioscuri, and Constantine himself on a column in the Forum, crowned with the sun rays of Apollo. The Christian city was a work in progress. The empire's political weight slid 1,400 kilometers east. The last step took another 50 years. On February 27, 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica. It required every subject to hold the Nicene faith. In 391 and 392, sacrifice was banned and temple doors were closed. Constantine did not make the empire Christian. He made being Christian safe, and then made it profitable. That took 13 years. Making it compulsory took another 67. What happens to a church that loses an argument? In 431, bishops gather at Ephesus. 20 years later, a much larger council meets at Chalcedon, across the water from Constantinople. Both are trying to settle one question: how divinity and humanity coexist in the person of Christ. Chalcedon produces a formula. It also produces a permanent split. The churches that rejected Chalcedon did not fade away. Coptic Egypt rejected it. So did the Syriac churches, Armenia, and Ethiopia. They have never rejoined. They still exist, with their own patriarchs and their own liturgies. Watch the map. For new colors appear here, and they stay for the rest of this film. There is a fifth. The Church of the East was centered on Seleucia Ctesiphon, on the Tigris, inside the Persian Empire. Roman emperors could not reach it. Persian shahs rather liked that. A Christian church answering to no Roman was a useful thing to own. Being outside the empire looked like exile. It turned out to be freedom of movement. No emperor sponsored these missionaries. No army went with them. Follow the Silk Road east. Bishops at Merv by the 6th century. A metropolitan at Samarkand. Congregations on the Malabar coast of India, trading in pepper. Then the long jump. In 635, a monk called Alapin reached Chang'an, the Tang capital, and probably the largest city on earth. Emperor Taizong received him. Christianity was granted permission to be preached in China. The proof is a stone. The Xi'an stele was unveiled on February 4, 781. 9 feet of limestone, inscribed in Chinese and Syriac, recording a century and a half of Christian presence and naming around 70 clergy. Around 845, the Tang court turned against foreign religions. The stele was buried. Chinese workmen dug it up in the 1620s. Word reached the Jesuits already in China, who could hardly believe what they were reading. It had been in the ground for nearly 800 years. A scale check. By about the year 1000, the Church of the East had, on one count, bishops in some 68 cities, from the Mediterranean coast to the Chinese interior. Other reckonings put it well above 100 dioceses, in 20-odd metropolitan provinces. Measured in square kilometers, it was the largest church on earth. Almost none of it was Roman. Almost none of it appears in the story Europe later told about itself. 200 years after losing the argument at Ephesus, they were preaching in the Chinese capital. The doctrine that lost in Europe traveled the furthest. Nothing replaced Rome. That is the fact to hold on to. In the West, there is no successor state, no functioning tax system, no continuity of administration. The city is sacked by Goths in 410. In 476, the last Western emperor is deposed in Italy. A rival claimant hangs on in Dalmatia until 480, and then the office is simply never filled again. What is left standing is a church. The Bishop of Rome inherits the property registers, the courier network, the archives, and the Latin language. Not by design. When the imperial machinery stopped, his was the only machinery still turning. Watch the gray shatter. Visigoths in Spain, Vandals in North Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in Gaul, Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Kingdoms where provinces used to be, each one a different color. The second institution is smaller and stranger. Around 530, Benedict writes a rule for his monastery at Monte Cassino, a daily timetable of prayer, manual work, and reading. That last item carries the West. Monasteries become the most durable literate institutions in the West. Libraries, infirmaries, seed stores, copying rooms. Columba crosses to Iona in 563. It is a small island off the west coast of Scotland. From Ireland and the islands, literacy is exported back into Britain and then onto the continent, not into a vacuum, but reinforcing the cathedral schools, chanceries, and lay literacy that had survived there. The conversion strategy is unapologetically top-down. You do not convert a population. You convert its king, and the population follows. Clovis of the Franks is baptized at Reims. Tradition says Christmas Day, 496. Historians argue for dates as late as 508. Augustine of Canterbury lands in Kent in 597. Boniface cuts down an oak sacred to Donner in Hesse in 723 and is killed in Frisia in 754. Court by court, Decade by decade, the colors flip. Peasant practice changes far more slowly, and that takes centuries. Then Christmas Day, 800. A pope places a Roman crown on the head of Charlemagne, king of the Franks. Neither man is Roman. The Western imperial title had been vacant for 324 years. Out of that one ceremony comes the political shape of Western Europe for the next 1,000 years. A Latin church and a Germanic monarchy, each insisting it authorizes the other. Neither can do without the other. The empire's last working institution turned out to be its religion, and the men who saved Latin literature had sworn never to leave the building. An alphabet is an odd thing to send abroad as an instrument of state. Constantinople sent one, and it outlasted the empire that sent it. Start with the city itself. By the 10th century, perhaps 300,000 people live inside the land walls. It is the richest city in Christendom, by a distance. Rome at the same moment is under 50,000, a ruined field with a population living in it. Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, holds the record for the largest enclosed space on Earth for nearly 1,000 years, until Seville Cathedral is finished in 1520. But the Eastern Church almost tears itself apart first. From roughly 726 to 843, emperors and bishops fight over images. May a painting of Christ or a saint be venerated, or is that idolatry? Mosaics are scraped from walls. Monasteries resist and are punished. The icons win in 843 after 2 separate bouts of iconoclasm. Images are banned from about 726, restored at Nicaea in 787, banned again in 815, and restored for good in 843. Roughly 90 years of destruction, spread across more than a century, in which the church wrecked its own art. Then the export. In 862, Prince Rastislav of Great Moravia asks Constantinople for missionaries who can teach in Slavonic. 2 brothers from Thessalonica are sent, Cyril and Methodius, who arrive the following year. Slavonic has never been written down, so they builded a script, Glagolitic, designed from scratch to carry scripture into a language that had no letters. Methodius kept working in Moravia after Cyril's death in 869. That is the whole strategy in one decision. Rome required Latin. Constantinople handed each people a written version of its own language and let it keep it. Now the map blooms north. Bulgaria's ruler Boris accepts baptism in 864. Cyrillic, the simplified descendant of Glagolitic, becomes the written language of his state and then of Serbia. In 988, Vladimir of Kiev is baptized, and the Rus are baptized in mass ceremonies in the Dnieper. The largest landmass in Europe joins the Eastern Church inside a single reign. About 250 million people write in Cyrillic today: Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and a long list from the Caucasus to Central Asia. By 1015, there are 2 Christian blocks on the map: Latin in the west, Greek and Slavonic in the east. They meet along a seam running down through the Balkans, and along that seam nobody is entirely sure who outranks whom. Byzantium's most durable export was not silk, or law, or gold. It was an alphabet, and it is still in daily use by 250 million people. 632. Muhammad dies at Medina. Within 4 years, Arab armies are fighting in Syria. The speed is the story. At Yarmouk in 636, the Byzantine field army is broken. Jerusalem surrenders in 638. Alexandria in 642. Carthage in 698. Iberia from 711. In roughly 80 years, the caliphates hold a continuous belt from the Pyrenees to the Indus. What was lost was not the edge of the Christian world. It was the middle. Of the 5 ancient patriarchates, 3 pass out of Christian rule inside 6 years: Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. Egypt, Syria, and North Africa held most of Christianity's population, its oldest monasteries, and its greatest theologians. The Copts, the Syriac churches, and the Church of the East all now live under Muslim rulers. How much in total? The historian Thomas Madden puts it at around 2/3 of the old Christian world. Other scholars phrase it as 1/3 or 1/2, depending where you draw the boundary and when you stop counting. Historians' estimates vary. Take the direction, not the decimal. Now the correction that matters most. Conquest was not conversion. Christians and Jews became dhimmi, protected communities, permitted their worship and their courts, taxed through the jizya, excluded from some offices. Subordination, not expulsion. Richard Boulliot's conversion curves are built from patterns in names and genealogies. They suggest Egypt did not become majority Muslim until somewhere between the 10th and the 14th century. Watch the map here. The color bleeds, it does not switch. That is centuries, not years. And it did not go the same way everywhere. Latin Christianity in North Africa, Augustine's church, had hundreds of bishoprics in the 5th century. It is down to roughly 40 bishops by the 8th. By the mid-12th century, the institution has effectively vanished. Next door, the Copts are still there. Roughly a tenth of Egypt's population today, though estimates vary. Same conquest, same tax code, two completely different endings. The map is not deterministic. Then look at what this does to the shape of Christendom. Its center of gravity is dragged out of the warm, wealthy, literate, urban south. It ends up in the cold, thinly settled, barely literate northwest. In Gaul, in the Rhineland, in Britain. That is not a triumph. That is a relocation under pressure. In the year 600, the center of the Christian world was Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. By 750, it was France. Christianity did not spread north. It retreated north. Two men, one building, one summer afternoon. Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, the 16th of July, 1054. Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida walks up the nave and lays a document on the high altar. It is a bull of excommunication against the patriarch of the city. Then he walks out and shakes the dust from his shoes. The quarrel behind it had been building for centuries. The West had added a word to the creed, filioque, and from the Son, without an Eastern Council's consent. The West used unleavened bread at the altar, the East used leavened. The West pushed celibacy on its clergy, Eastern priests married. Latin was the language of one, Greek of the other. Under all of it sat one question. Did the Bishop of Rome outrank the other for patriarchs, or merely sit first among them? Patriarch Michael Cerularius replied in kind. He convened a synod and excommunicated the legates who had brought the bull. Then comes the detail that makes 1054 smaller than it looks. Pope Leo IX, who had sent Humbert, had died on the 19th of April. The legates had been acting for a dead man for almost 3 months. And almost nobody at the time treated this as a rupture. The excommunications named individuals, not churches. Greek and Latin bishops went on writing to each other. Reunion was attempted at Lyon in 1274, and again at Florence in 1439. There the two sides signed a decree of union. The people of Constantinople refused it. Councils can sign, congregations vote with their feet. What made the split permanent was not a document. It was an army. In 1202, a crusade gathers at Venice, aimed at Egypt. It cannot pay the Venetians for its ships. So it is diverted, first to the Adriatic port of Zara, then to Constantinople, drawn in by a claimant to the Byzantine throne. In April 1204, the Crusaders break into the richest Christian city on earth and sack it for 3 days. Churches are stripped. Relics are crated up for Latin cathedrals. The 4 bronze horses of the Hippodrome are shipped to Venice, where, apart from an 18-year detour to Paris under Napoleon, they have been ever since. The originals now sit indoors. The horses on the facade are copies. A Latin emperor is installed in the city and holds it for 57 years. The Byzantines take Constantinople back in 1261 and never fully recover. 2 men excommunicated each other, and one of them was acting for a pope who had been dead 3 months. What actually split the churches took another 150 years and a sacked city. No institution in Europe has ever held the power the church held between 1100 and 1300. It crowned kings, and it unmade them. Its courts handled marriage, wills, oaths, and heresy. It owned, by many estimates, 1/4 to 1/3 of the cultivated land in the West. That power announced itself at Clermont, in central France, in November 1095. Urban II called on Western knights to march east, to aid the Christians of the Eastern Empire, and to take Jerusalem. Perhaps 60,000 set out. In July 1099, they stormed Jerusalem and killed much of the population, Muslim and Jewish, fighters and civilians alike. 4 Crusader states were established: Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem along the coast, and Edessa, 200 kilometers inland across the Euphrates, which is why it is the first to fall. Watch the shape of the other 3. They are a coastal ribbon, rarely more than 100 kilometers deep, held by a permanently insufficient number of Europeans in very good castles. Edessa falls in 1144. At Hattin in 1187, Saladin destroys the Crusader field army, and Jerusalem surrenders within months. Acre, the last mainland stronghold, falls in 1291. 2 centuries of expeditions, and the map, ends where it began. In Europe, meanwhile, the Church behaves as a state above states. In January 1077, King Henry IV waits outside the castle of Canossa in the snow for 3 days to have his excommunication lifted. He would not be crowned emperor for another 7 years, and when he was, it was by a pope of his own making. In 1302, the bull Unam Sanctum claims papal authority over every human being alive. That is the high water mark. It is also roughly when the tide turns. The same institution builds Europe's first universities, Bologna from 1088, then Paris, then Oxford, and the cathedrals, an illiterate clerical class staffing every chancery from Portugal to Poland. It also builds machinery for enforcement. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, destroys the Cathar communities of southern France. The Papal Inquisition follows from 1231. The Spanish Inquisition, a royal institution, is founded in 1478. Here the popular number is badly wrong. The historian Henry Kamen, working from trial records, puts executions at around 2,000. Others reach 3,000 to 5,000 across 350 years. Historians' estimates vary. The order of magnitude does not. Then the authority collapses without help. Plague reaches Sicily in 1347 and kills perhaps a third of Europe by 1351. The popes sit at Avignon, not Rome, from 1309 to 1377. From 1378, there are 2 popes, and briefly 3, each excommunicating the others. It takes until 1417 to get back to 1. Averaged out, that is a handful of executions a year, and almost all of them in the first 50 years. For most of its life, the Inquisition killed almost nobody, and terrified a continent anyway, which tells you the institution's real weapon was never the fire. It was the file. Jan Hus said it first. Preaching in Prague, he attacked the sale of indulgences, demanded scripture in the vernacular, and denied that any pope stood above a council. He was given safe conduct to the Council of Constance. He was tried there and burned on the 6th of July, 1415. His movement survived in Bohemia and almost nowhere else. A century later, a friar in Wittenberg says much the same, and the map of Europe changes color. The difference is a machine. Gutenberg's press is working at Mainz by the 1450s. By 1500, there are print shops in more than 250 European towns, and Wittenberg has one a short walk from Luther's door. Watch the print pins first. The confessional colors follow them. In October 1517, Luther circulates 95 theses against the indulgence trade, money raised across Germany to rebuild St. Peter's in Rome, sold with a promise of remitted punishment for sin. That is the specific mechanism. A building fund running through German parishes. The print numbers carry the chapter. 30 of Luther's pamphlets ran through some 370 editions between 1517 and 1520. Historians estimate several 100,000 copies. German pamphlet output multiplies several times over in a few years. Luther alone accounts for roughly a fifth of everything printed in German lands in the period. Hus wrote in Czech for Bohemia. Luther wrote in German, and German had presses. At Worms in 1521, he refuses to recant before the emperor. He is outlawed, and a prince hides him. That is how the map actually fractures, by ruler, not by conscience. Saxony turns Lutheran because its elector does. Henry VIII breaks with Rome in the Act of Supremacy of 1534 over a marriage and a jurisdiction. Calvin's Geneva, from 1536, exports a second and sterner Protestantism to France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 writes the rule down, later summarized as cuius regio, ius religio. The prince chooses. The subjects follow or move. Though only between Rome and Wittenberg, Calvinists get nothing until 1648. Rome regroups. The Council of Trent, sitting between 1545 and 1563, tightens doctrine and discipline. The Jesuits, founded in 1540, become its schoolmasters. Then the cost. France fights 8 civil wars in 36 years. In Paris, on the 24th of August 1572, the killing of Huguenots spreads from the capital into a dozen provincial cities. Estimates run from about 5,000 to 30,000 dead. Historians' estimates vary. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, is worse by an order of magnitude, an estimated 4.5 to 8 million dead. Parts of Germany lose more than half their people. Württemberg, Pomerania, the Palatinate. Westphalia ends it by conceding what nobody would concede in 1517. Europe will not be religiously one. Luther's arguments were not new. Hus made most of them a century earlier and was burned for it. What Luther had that Hus did not was a printing press within a day's ride of his door. Look at the map in 1900. Christianity is, overwhelmingly, a European religion and a European export. Africa is about 9% Christian, roughly 10 million people. Within a century, that map is unrecognizable. Here's how it got there. Start with the crossing. From 1492, the Atlantic opens, and mission and conquest arrive on the same ships. Cortés takes Tenochtitlan in 1521. The encomienda system hands indigenous labor to Spanish settlers, in theory in exchange for instruction in the faith. Baptisms are recorded in the hundreds of thousands. From the mid-16th century, the Shrine of Guadalupe, outside Mexico City, its origin story set in 1531, gives the new church an image that is not European. The argument about all this happens inside the church. Bartolomé de las Casas, an encomendero turned Dominican, spends 40 years attacking the conquest. In 1550 and 1551, he faces Juan Gines de Sepúlveda at Valladolid, before a royal junta, over one question: whether the peoples of the Americas could be justly conquered and enslaved. Neither side wins outright. Laws change. Practice largely does not. But the argument is held in Spain, in public, in the middle of the conquest. Then Asia. Francis Xavier lands at Kagoshima in 1549. Matteo Ricci reaches Beijing in 1601 and works in Chinese, in Confucian dress. Protestant missions come much later. William Carey to Bengal in 1793. David Livingstone lands in southern Africa in 1841 and pushes into the interior from the 1850s. When the missionary societies meet at Edinburgh in 1910, the assumption in the room is unchanged. The North sends. The South receives. That assumption dies inside one lifetime. Latin America passes Europe in Christian population in 2014. Africa passes Latin America in 2018, about 631 million, against Latin America's 601 million and Europe's 571. Today, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity puts Africa above 700 million, out of roughly 2.6 billion Christians worldwide. Pew, counting more strictly, puts sub-Saharan Africa at 31% of all Christians in 2020, and Europe at 22%. The growth is not mainly Catholic or mainline Protestant. It is Pentecostal and independent. Churches founded in Lagos, Nairobi, Seoul, and Sao Paulo, led by people who were never anyone's mission field. More Nigerians go to an Anglican church on a Sunday than English people do. South Korea sends missionaries abroad in the thousands, some of them to Europe. Meanwhile, church attendance across Western Europe has fallen for 100 years, and many cathedrals now fill mainly with tourists. Watch the marker. Christianity's demographic center of gravity sat near the Mediterranean in the first millennium, drifted northwest into Europe, and has spent the last century traveling south, down through Spain, across the Sahara, into West Africa. For roughly 12 centuries, the center of the Christian map sat in Europe. It moved in a single lifetime, and it moved to the one continent 19th century Europeans had gone there to convert.